This is going to sound like a pretty hot take, but hear me out, because I genuinely believe that Muhammad Mokaev leaving the UFC could be the best thing that ever happens to his career. Now, what's happened recently, to be honest, is quite unprecedented. We've never seen a professional or an amateur quite as talented as he is on paper. I know that's going to rile a lot of people up, but when you actually look at what this man's done in his career already, and he's only 24 years of age. He's a two-time IMMAF champion. Now, if you don't know what that is, that's the highest standard of amateur mixed martial arts. And when you see the guys that have come through that circuit, and when you see the talent that's available there, that's a very high level. So he's not only 12-0 in his professional career, he's 7-0 in the UFC. And if you go back to his amateur career as well, he is 36-0. Just think about that. 36 fights, 0 defeats. Amateur and professional, and he's 24 years of age. So the fact that he got to the top of the flyweight division and now he's been axed, we haven't really seen anything like this before, at least on this scale. And he's definitely someone who has a following as well. He's definitely someone that resonates with fans from across the world. And when you look at the organizations that he's fought in already, like Brave, like the IMMAFs, for example, and the teams that he's been involved in, KHK, Aspire, there's no secret to why people are following him. Very charismatic, very successful, and quite a cheeky chappy as well. But let me tell you why I actually think this is quite a good move. And before we get into that, let me lay the table of why he got kicked out of the UFC, because there's a lot of storylines and a lot of narratives around this, and I think a lot of them are incorrect for the most part. A lot of people are talking about how his style is the reason that he got axed. This is not true. This is simply not true. And not to throw shade on the champion, but we live in a world where Belal Muhammad is currently the welterweight champion. So it is not a style thing. And when you actually look at his career so far in the UFC, not only is he 7-0, but 4 of those are finishes. And you look at the guys that he's fighting against, the likes of Tim Elliott, the likes of Charles Johnson, the likes of Manel Kape. This is quite honestly some of the hardest fights you're going to get. Veterans in the game, tough matchups. Charles Johnson, who's finally putting together some really good momentum. Incredible cardio, very well-rounded. Tim Elliott is an absolute veteran of the game, seen everything and beaten a lot of good guys. So when you look at what Mokaev's done with his career, yes, every fight hasn't been a finish, but he's still very exciting. Make no mistake. The first time I ever watched him live was in London. On his debut, he comes out against Cody Durden, who, again, extremely tough matchup. Now, if you're young and if you're new to the UFC, you're new to the bright lights, you're new to the organisation, a matchup like Cody Durden's an absolute nightmare. The man is as tough as nails, he's very well-rounded, he has no quit, and he can finish a fight as well. So to come out in front of the London home crowd after COVID, where there's a massive build-up, there's a lot of anticipation in the crowd, flying switch knee and guillotine chokes him in the first round. And people are sitting here trying to tell me he's not exciting. That's why I'm telling you that's a false narrative. Now, the reason why he was actually cut, when you look into the X's and O's of it, is essentially he was a ball ache to the organisation. That's the long and short of it. He was a ball ache to the organisation. And as much as I like Mokaev, what he's done in his career and his persona online and on the mic, I saw it firsthand, to be quite honest. When I was in UFC Manchester, I saw exactly what that looked like firsthand for the UFC, because not only did he have to have additional security with him everywhere that he went, he also had to have security for the opponents that he had beef with. So you're already starting to ruin the logistics of a UFC fight week, and typically they run as smooth as butter. So you're already throwing a few bumps in the road. And then just on that fight week alone, you take a look at the people on the card. Had previous beef with Paddy Pimblett, very extensive ongoing beef with Jake Hadley, who was on the card, and then of course Manel Kape. So not only did they have all the security with them, of course, then you get the altercation outside of the hotel room, which I was sitting right next to just before it happens. I go upstairs to go and grab something to eat, a little meal deal. I went to Sainsbury's, got a little meal deal. I went to get that from the fridge in the Fighters Hotel. My friend calls me and said, you might want to come and see this. I come downstairs and there is all this commotion. And as you'll know by now, the story goes, they asked Manel Kape for a photo and then essentially they get into it and they get into a scuffle. And that is prior to that incident, them being in the UFC PI and again having an altercation where Manel Kape headbutted Mokaev. Now that necessarily isn't his fault, but again, it's just red flags for the UFC. It's just another story. It's another thing to notch onto the naughty list that is Muhammad Mokaev. So when you factor that in, you factor in the altercation, and again, logistically for the UFC, this is a major fight. This is a really, really big fight that they don't want to lose from the card. And honestly, when I first saw everything that was happening with Mokaev and Kape outside of the hotel, I was surprised that Manel Kape made it to fight week because he weren't in a great way. He really weren't in a great way whatsoever. So I was actually surprised that the fight was still on. I knew that he'd want to compete. I knew that him personally, he would say, I'm okay, I'm still going to go through with this. But more so his team. I didn't know if his team would look at him and say, you know what, we're going to just pull you out of this one. We don't want you to go into this fight compromised because there's a lot on the line. So that is why he actually got pulled. Not his style whatsoever. But then it gets a little bit dicey for him because he then is axed by the UFC. And then this is when the story starts circulating. Dana White does him absolutely no favours whatsoever because in the post-fight press conference, he said, I think he'll be a really nice addition to the PFL. And that just rubbed them up the wrong way. And the PFL had a pride and ego perspective about this new signing. They came out and said, we don't want Mokaev. We heard he's a headache. We don't want him. That wasn't because of what they'd heard. And that wasn't because they didn't like his style. And it wasn't because they don't have a flyweight division. That was a pride thing. Most certainly, that was a pride and ego thing. So the PFL were out the question now. He did come out and say that they'd already made him an offer, of which they refused and said that wasn't the case. I tend to believe him, to be perfectly honest. I tend to believe that there were conversations. I'm not sure how in depth, but before this. So who do we have left? We've got the likes of Karate Combat, we've got the likes of Brave, and we've also got ACA. These are the main ones that have reached out to him, and he even came on a post the other day and said these were the organisations which have already reached out, including Risen as well, or Risen, which would have been pretty fun, let's be real. No conversations, or at least no whispers of ONE FC, which would have been fun, a potential matchup with Demetrius Johnson. Now, when I first heard this all going on, I thought Karate Combat made the most sense, to be perfectly honest. I thought they would do a fantastic job of building his profile even more. And they put on some really fun shows and it reaches very far areas of the internet. So I thought that was a smart move. Now, speaking to some people a little bit closer to the situation, they wasn't so convinced that strictly stand-up was going to be the best way to showcase his talents. And I think that's probably fair. I think that's true, to be honest. Because even though he has good striking, it's his mixed martial arts game which really makes him excel. And I think if he's going to take a step away from the UFC, he needs something which is going to paint him in the best light. Now, the reason I actually think this is the best thing for his career, because speaking to someone, again, close to this situation, they said, again, just rumours, don't shoot the messenger, with a few wins, and I imagine some variety of an apology video or something like that, he'll be back in the UFC. And I do foresee that, to be perfectly honest. I think if he goes away, gets 3 impressive wins, comes out and says, you know what, I was young, I apologise, it won't happen again, I'm sorry, I think he slides straight back in. Now, the reason I think that's so good is because, do I think he can compete with the champions right now? For sure. Do I think he can compete with the top contenders? 100%. We've seen that. But do I think it will potentially do him a favour if he goes away, works on a few areas of his game, comes back at, say, 25, 26 years of age with 3 impressive finishes, a bigger profile, and guess what? The entire media storm that comes with all of this. So they always say there's no such thing as bad publicity, and to be honest, if he goes and gets 3 wins, I think it does him a favour, because I think it matures him both emotionally and within his game. And when you look at his game now, like I said, he does have good striking, but he can still add things to this. He still can add, I would say, elements to the boxing to help blend it together. And one element of his grappling, which I think he gets a lot of criticism for, is the lack of damage. Now, he does have submissions and he does have wrestling. Let's be very clear about that. But he does have periods of time throughout fights where there's a lack of damage. And what I'll refer that back to is if you look at Khabib's career, Khabib does a fantastic job at using a lot of his control with the lower half of his body, which frees up his arms and it frees up his elbows. When you watch Muhammad Mokaev in his grappling exchanges, he's often in this position quite a lot. Often got the hands locked around the body lock, and he's establishing position and he's dominant and he's securing rounds, but there's not so much damage. So I think some very small tweaks to his game. I think a slight maturity in his mindset and his approach to the overall side of the game. And I actually think this could be very beneficial for him. Now, to finish, where do I actually think he'll go? I think he goes back to Brave, to be perfectly honest. I think that makes the most sense for him logistically in regards to he's already been there, of course. That's where he came from. Also, he knows people that side of the world. He has very, very good relationships there where he gets taken care of. And I think they'll do a good job in pushing him. So he did post a video the other day of where he had the new gloves. And if you sort of zoom in, you can see the branding. And the branding is that of Top 10, I believe it is. That sponsor, or at least now are full-time partners with Brave. So I do anticipate he'll go back to Brave. And I do actually anticipate this might be a good thing for his career. But let me know in the comments what you think. Please drop a subscribe if you're new here. I'm going to be pumping out a ton more of this type of content because a lot of people ask for it. And I probably should have done a long time ago. And as always, keep it casual.